I can see it now.
I guess, yeah, now 100%.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes,
Okay.
we can.
Okay, today I will talk about John Florio. John Florio is today recognized as the most important humanist in Renaissance England. He created more than 1,000 new words for the English language. He translated the essays of Michel de Montaigne, and he published the first Italian-English dictionary, A World of Words, in 1598. However, today I will not discuss about John Florio, the famous translator and the creative lexicographer. I will discuss the extraordinary public personality that John Florio was able to create for himself, which enabled him to obtain different secret jobs like spy, agent, and ghostwriter, and he collaborated extensively with his contemporaries and friends to bring forward his projects behind his personal motto, "Who leaves content has all the world at will." The first secret job that John Florio obtained was in 1583. In that period, he was working in London at the French embassy as tutor to Catherine Mary, the daughter of the French ambassador Michel de Castelnau. He also worked as a secretary to the French ambassador. However, in that period, he received an offer by Francis Walsingham, the spy master of Queen Elizabeth I. See him in the picture here on the left. Why? Because in that period, Queen Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, was trying to take the English throne and reestablish Catholicism, and many plans were planned to help her. One of these plans was the Babington plot, planned by Anthony Babington. Anthony Babington wrote many letters in codes to Mary, secret letters. But what Mary and Anthony Babington didn't know was that someone was following them and someone was deciphering the secret letters in codes. One of these spies was John Florio, who helped Queen Elizabeth I and helped Francis Walsingham. In fact, soon later, both Anthony Babington and Queen of Scots were condemned to death. After this period at the French embassy with secret plots and spies, John Florio worked between 1586 and 1588, which are considered his lost years because he basically disappeared. But he didn't disappear because he was working as agent between London, Oxford, and Ireland with English aristocrats and Italian ambassadors, and his activities were many. He both worked in the espionage and diplomacy because Italian was the official language for these activities. Later, in 1590, John Florio became tutor to Henry Wriothesley, the third Earl of Southampton, one of the most important and influential literary and theatrical patrons of the Elizabethan period. Henry, you can see him here on the right, was a beautiful, rich, and young nobleman. And John Florio worked with Henry as his personal tutor, secretary, teaching Henry Italian language, Italian literature. They both went to theater together, and Florio lived with Henry for many years in his house. However, both John Florio and Henry one day were involved into a murder. Why? Because Henry Wriothesley had two friends, Henry and Charles Danvers. The Danvers family had a neighbor, the Long family. The Long family and the Danvers family didn't get on well with each other. There were many quarrels and scuffles between the servants of both families, until one day these quarrels escalated into a murder. One night, while Harry Long of the Long family was dining with his friends in a pub in the city of Southampton, Charles and Harry Danvers walked into the pub and they killed Harry Long, and he died on the spot. The Long family was shocked and they asked for justice. So they asked the sheriff of Southampton to do something and to investigate. But on the other hand, Henry and Charles Danvers asked Harry Risley to do something and they asked for help. And Harry asked John Florio to stop the sheriff. So what happened was that one Saturday night, while the sheriff of Southampton, Sheriff Groves, was on a boat with his wife, he met John Florio, and John Florio threatened the sheriff of Southampton with many intimidating words and threatening to cast him overboard. The result was that both Henry and Charles Danvers safely escaped to France, and none was ever interrogated or condemned. So, as you can see, Florio's activities were many. On the surface, he was translator, writer, lexicographer, but he also worked as spy agent. And he also was a ghostwriter. He collaborated extensively with his contemporaries and friends. I'll make some examples. He published with two playwrights, Matthew Gwynne, Paul Greville, Philip Sidney, Arcadia. Philip Sidney, that you can see here on the right, was one of the most influential and important poets of the Elizabethan period. He published the very first book that contains the first sonnets of the Elizabethan period. However, Philip Sidney sadly died too young during a war in Netherlands, and he left a work unfinished, Arcadia, a beautiful pastoral love story. John Florio, who was a close friend of Philip Sidney, decided to commemorate Philip Sidney with his friends, the dramatists Paul Greville and Matthew Gwynne, and they revised and edited Philip Sidney Arcadia, and they published Arcadia in 1590. So John Florio worked as editor and revised this work with his friends. Later, while he was tutor to Henry Risley, John Florio also collaborated with Vincenzo Saviolo. Vincenzo Saviolo was one of the most important fencing masters in England, in London, was very popular, and he was also the fencing master of both Henry, the third Earl of Southampton, and the Earl of Essex. Florio collaborated with Saviolo, and he published a manual on fencing in 1594, Saviolo His Practice. This work is the product of a collaboration between Saviolo, who had a technical knowledge on fencing, but he didn't speak English, and John Florio, who translated and re-elaborated other works and wrote entertaining dialogues in English. Florio also collaborated with other playwrights like Ben Jonson. You can see here, Ben Jonson is one of the most famous playwrights of his time. And they collaborated for a comedy, maybe one of the most famous comedy of Ben Jonson, Volpone, or The Fox. They wrote this comedy together, and there is a manuscript today at the British Library with a copy of this comedy that contains a handwritten dedication by Ben Jonson to John Florio, in which Ben Jonson writes, you can see the manuscript here, and Ben Jonson describes John Florio as his loving father and loving friend, and the aid, the help of his muses, which means that John Florio was prized and was respected by his contemporaries and friends, and he helped and collaborated extensively with them. He also translated anonymously Boccaccio's Decameron in 1620, the very first English translation of Decameron. But why such an important translator and respected writer wrote anonymously? You should know that John Florio was born in London, but his father was Italian. We know nothing about his mother, but it is pretty sure that his father was Italian, and John Florio felt himself English. He described himself as English at heart, and he was a very ambitious writer. However, in the Elizabethan period, there was also a huge xenophobia towards foreigners, and especially Italians. There was also a proverb coined by an English schoolmaster. An Englishman in Italian is a devil incarnate, which shows the hate that many Englishmen had towards Italian. So while English nobility and the aristocracy loved Italian literature, they loved Italian language, and the aristocracy were eager to learn Italian because Italian culture was very popular during the Elizabethan period. At the same time, if you were Italian and you walk in the streets of London, it was pretty dangerous. And Florio in 1591, in Second Fruits, his second work, confessed that he received many death threats. In fact, John Florio wrote, "My enemies have a knife at command to cut my throat, because an Englishman in Italian is a devil incarnate." So while many writers in the Elizabethan period used anonymity, there were many political and religious pamphlets published anonymously because obviously you could easily lose your head for your ideas. Anonymity was also pretty popular. There were many contemporaries of John Florio who wrote with a pseudonym or anonymously. For example, before I mentioned Matthew Gwynne, who was a playwright, a writer. Matthew Gwynne used the pseudonym Il Candido. The Earl of Essex also used the pseudonym A.B. So it was also the fashion of the time. But for Florio, it was a matter of survival. So when he published the second edition of his dictionary in 1611, Queen Anna's New World of Words, John Florio added a portrait of himself that you can see here. And he wrote a motto, a proverb. Here you can read it in Italian. Chi si contenta gode, which means, who lives content has all the world at will. What does this mean? It means that it is more important to be grateful for what you do, even in the shadows, than to be prized for it. John Florio was a hard-working writer. He collaborated extensively with his contemporaries and friends because for him it was more important to bring forward his idea and projects, that of expanding English language, expanding English literature, and to give his country, England, a cultural and political identity in a period, the Elizabethan era, in which England was still creating its own identity, in which English was not the popular language that we know today. In Elizabethan England, very few people spoke English. John Florio himself was very critical toward English language, but he wanted to change it, he wanted to improve it. And it was also thanks to writers like John Florio the English language became the popular language we know today. So for Florio, it was more important to bring forward these projects, cultural and political projects for his country, anonymously in the shadows, than to be prized for it. But sadly, after his death, John Florio was very soon forgotten. But something is changing, because in the last decades, many scholars have re-evaluated the great impact that his works had on English literature. They have underlined the great influence that he had on English language and English literature, prizing his great style while translating. So today I could talk about John Florio, the creative lexicographer or the great translator, but I wanted instead to talk about John Florio, the shrewd spy, the smart agent, and the ghostwriter, because I wanted to show you that he had a multifaceted personality, multi-layered identity, and I wanted to show you that his career as a translator and lexicographer was only a fragment of a much intriguing and gifted genius that I hope one day the world will recognize. Thank you very much. Do you have questions?
Thank you very much, Marianna. Thank you. That was an interesting presentation. It's difficult to clasp, unfortunately. That is the biggest disadvantage of distance conference. Thank you all the presenters. And now we have, I think, about 15 minutes for questions. I noticed that we are 15 minutes late, so we'll start the second session without a longer break. I will just.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Pani Magdalena Cordes, I've seen you waiting. Yeah.
Well, I would like to say that, Małgosia, James, Marianna, I loved your piece of work. It was really nice to hear that, those things. But I've got a question to Marianna, because, of course, Aretha Franklin, Mozart, we know of those people quite a lot. But, I was shocked what you said. I was listening to your work, and I can't imagine how John Florio was such an amazing person. So how is it possible, or maybe what has changed in Italian people's mind, that he's discovered once again? Yes, because you said that he was forgotten.
Yes.
So
yes,
why
after his death? Yes, after his death, he has been soon forgotten, also due to the fact that he worked anonymously, So it was later when many scholars have studied these works, like Ben Jonson or Saviolo or Arcadia, and they have discovered that there were Florio's fingerprints all over these works. But at the same time, sadly, his personality, career, and works have been distorted throughout the centuries, mainly by Shakespeare scholars in the 19th century, during the Victorian era mostly. But later, in 20th century, there have been new scholars. I'll just mention some: Francis Amelia Eads, Clara Longworth de Chambrun. They were all Shakespeare scholars and Florio scholars who have published great works and biographies on John Florio, and they have underlined that he was a great writer, a great translator, and that people had to rediscover his life, his works, and the great legacy that he left in Renaissance England. So it basically started in the 20th century, and later in the last decades, other young modern scholars have written other works about John Florio, reevaluating the great impact that he had, not just in lexicography. I mentioned Florio is the third greatest lexicographer, along with Chaucer and Shakespeare. but they also have reevaluated his impact in English literature, and as I have shown you, how great was the web of collaboration, and writers that brought together.
Yeah.
We tend to believe that, writers and playwrights work alone, they just they didn't have any collaboration. They wrote everything alone in their studio, in their office. But in the Elizabethan period, especially in the Elizabethan period, in which there was a great, in which theatre, for example, was very popular, and there was a great high demand for plays, and it was very, very popular. Theatre became popular basically in the 76 with the first theatre. And then there was a great boom of theatres in London, and there was a great high demand for plays. And in that period, plays were mainly written with collaboration. There were many writers who collaborated and basically rewrote all the stories. So now we tend to believe that authors like Ben Jonson or Shakespeare, they were great genius who worked and wrote everything alone. But instead, there was a great collaboration going on in the period, actually. And that's where Florio fit in,
And one thing, do we know, was his mother English, or because we know that his father was Italian, but we do not. You didn't say anything about his mother. Was she poor? Was she rich? I don't know.
His mother was a servant.
Oh my God!
She was a servant in the house of William Cecil, who was a man and worked with Queen Elizabeth. And she was a servant in the house of Cecil. And there was a huge scandal where John Florio was born, actually, because his father was a Franciscan friar. He converted to Protestantism, and he worked in the Italian church in London. And while working as a preacher, he had a secret relationship with this servant that worked in the house of Cecil. Michelangelo Florio was Florio's father. He was tutor to William Cecil, so they were both in the same house, and they had this secret relationship. And at the time, it was a great shock and a huge scandal because she was pregnant when they were not married. So when they discovered that this woman was pregnant and that Michelangelo had a secret relationship, he was banished from Italian church. They kicked him out of Italian church, and Florio was a bastard son, and at the time was a great scandal, But later they got married, and they fixed it with a marriage, and then yes. So
great, thank you.
But we know nothing. We don't know if she was Italian or French. I don't think she was English, actually, because servants, most of English aristocracy, they preferred to have servants that were either Italian or French. So it is possible that she was either Italian or French, actually.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I also know that Marianna has got a question. I just wanted, before I give you voice, I just wanted to ask you about your book, because I know that you published sonnets.
Yes. It's my.
Do you have it?
Yes, it's my latest research about John Florio, because he was also a poet, and he wrote sonnets in both Italian and English. The Italian sonnets are dedicated to his patron, Queen Anne of Denmark. Florio worked as a royal tutor to Queen Anne of Denmark, and he wrote sonnets in Italian for her, and have discovered these sonnets. And since none basically ever talk about it, I decided to write a book about it. And there are sonnets in both Italian and English that he wrote during his career that show that he was truly a creative writer that was able to write in both iambic pentameter with English style and Petrarca sonnet in Italian. So you can show that he truly could jump from Italian English in different styles, and shows that he was truly a great genius.
Do you have this book with you now? Can you show us the cover? Or
yeah, here it is.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So this is the beautiful cover.
Yes, it's a flower. I play with Florian flower name, and it's a flower, and at the center there is the title, John Florio's Italian and English sonnet, and here there is the feather, the pen.
Yeah. Lovely, thank you. And you also had the question, so maybe
yes,
the last question.
I have a question about Retta.